Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave of the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
And I'm Tony.
And we're in the first chapter for us, but fourth chapter for our book, Craig Keener's book on miracles, which is kind of a more academic book that we've taken on before. And hopefully that doesn't scare you away. It just means there's usually a lot more citations at the bottom of the page, where citations belong, not at the back of the book, but at the bottom of the page where we're drawing this from. And so the book for this one is a little bit on the expensive side, which is to say more than 2
volumes, right?
Right, which is more than the $4 Kindle version, but even the Kindle version is only off by a couple bucks if you want to go that route. And finding one on a book is a little bit difficult. But also included in the links is going to be kind of the more popular version of it that he's recently kind of come out with. And so we've seen that happen with Scott Christensen's What About Evil? Defeating Evil was his kind of more popular slimmed down version of that. And so you can check out both those books and the review of them on thecross.com. But now we're going to pick back up in the middle of our chapter 4, Anti-Supernaturalism as an authenticity criterion. And we found out that even ancient historians seem to be a little weary of paranormal or miracle claims. And we've talked a little bit about some of the ancient kind of Greek historians, and we kind of left our case on Polybus and his kind of negative outlook on people that utilize what for him seems to be not so much miracle claims, but utilizing grandiose stories to kind of draw attentions to the readers for these historians to make the story more interesting. He says, well, it seems to be more sensationalism than actually telling what actually happened. So he wants to leave kind of those kind of true miracle claims or things that were just a normal part of the story in there and let the audience decide, the kind of c'est la vie of historians there. And so we're going to pick up back up at the signs in critical historians and say that surely, however, not all historians whom Polybus characterizes as sensationalists would have agreed with his description. So even in early historian time periods, there's a disagreement among historians. Who knew that would continue to
go
this
figure,
day?
right?
Yeah. I have an opinion, and there's going to be 6 people in a room of 5 people that disagree with me. Historians did not need to resort to wholesale anti-supernaturalism to exercise critical judgment. But the imperial period, historians often included miraculous and fantastic elements, and not every writer who included paranormal events was genuinely sensational. So there seems to be things that happen.
So this imperial period here is talking about where the Romans, ruled the emperors and that kind of stuff. That's the period he's getting at here.
Right. So it seems to be that, the critique is that there are these historians, these people who seem to be, embellishing quite a bit to the point of unbelievability or absurdity or adding paranormal activity for the purposes of making their story more interesting. But there are also other writers who seem to just be including them and saying, this is a story that was claimed about this person and this odd thing happened, and then do with it what you will, and we move on from there. So whereas Lucian and Polybus are skeptical, many Greeks and Roman historians reported curiosities in their sources ambivalent between skepticism and credulity. Others allowed both natural and divine factors side by side. So they just kind of wanted to report what was said. If miracle claims were to occur, like, again, elephants crossing the Alps and being implanted in the north of the Roman Empire, seems to be a weird claim that wouldn't be possible, especially with the technology and all these things that we modern people know. Yet it seems to be a very fun story that we apply to Hannibal the Carthage.
Yeah. So notice when we say just the facts, ma'am, these folks were saying the facts were what was reported, whether it was supernatural or not, right? Today, we would say the facts are based on the Enlightenment worldview, right, are non-miraculous things, right? Those are the facts. And so that's what he's trying to help us to see here, right? The criterion for judging what happened is different, changed during the Enlightenment period, because these folks just reported the way they were. Although these folks were, to a certain extent, some of them anyway, skeptical about these various claims. Still, they reported the facts as they were described to them. So he goes on to say that, I think this is Livy, is among the writers after Polybus who chronicles reports of unusual events, right, called prodigies. Back then, Hume uses this term as well. For each year, some of these we would regard as natural phenomena and others as originally fabricated, but they undoubtedly stem from Livy's sources. Tacitus averrs that a dignified historian ought not to collect fabulous tales merely to delight his readers. So you don't just, collect these tales just because, you want your readers to be excited, but warns that he cannot dare deny the truth of common tradition. So notice Tacitus here is making a distinction between the historian or a writer who collects these tales so that he can keep people reading his stuff as opposed to ones that don't. But he himself can't deny the truth of some of the common stories that he was familiar with. And of course, Keener goes on to tell us that other sources strongly suggest that Tacitus personally believed at least in the gods and in sacrificing to them. So obviously he couldn't deny it because he believed in the gods as well.
Right. And let's also take into account, too, that the claim isn't about a society's stories versus it's not caring about those. It's talking about the histories, the things that are said to have happened in a time and a place with certain context. So things like the Iliad is known to be a story. It's Homer's writing this epic, but he also seems to be including parts of history. So it's almost this historical fiction, but people are of understanding that, the gods interfering with Hector and Achilles isn't part of the history, but it's part of the story. And that's not being what's talked about here. What's being talked about here is, the events of, there might have been a war of Troy, but we understand that the Iliad is a story that may be concerning historical facts, that Homer probably went to the area and saw the battlefields and knew how to talk about the land for his story. So I think that's something, too, that we have to distinguish between the stories of a society versus the history that may include things like these paranormal claims or miracle claims, or may have a blending into it. And that's where Tacitus and Polybus, I think, rightly cover that embellishing upon it is not story here, but we're wanting to include history, and we want to leave the story to the storytellers and history to the historians. All right, so many historians sometimes qualified reports with "it is said" or similar cautionary devices. Reporting wonders in their sources freely, they nevertheless distance themselves from seeming too credulous by warning readers to evaluate the veracity of such reports for themselves, which is very, very interesting here, is they wanted to include it. They think, well, it may have happened. I might be skeptical of it himself, but this clue-in feature here of think of, if you're reading your Bible, the behold. It's to grab your attention. It's to you're going through all these claims, and all of a sudden a behold comes up and it kind of shakes you up. So this "it is said" is a clue to hear that, listen, we're just reporting what was said. We're not making any claims here, and so it's up to you to figure out if this is the case. But this is the good of historians to want to almost over-include details, because if you're just going to leave it to the person whose their job is to write things down, and they make their value claims based on their prejudices, well, then they might be leaving out a lot of things here. And we kind of see that too with elements within the Muslim histories as well. All right, so yet despite a higher level of skepticism fashionable among the intelligentsia than among many others, ancient historians were not products of the radical Enlightenment. So what does that look like? What don't they bring in, or what do they bring in, or what positives or what negatives do they bring in here? They could not simply expect all readers to disbelieve all claims of supernatural activity without argument. The majority of ancient historians were critical of some reports while accepting the possibilities of others. That is, they did not a priori decide all claims of the paranormal events to be either authentic or inauthentic. We do not, for that reason, reject their authenticity as historians or the authenticity of other reports they offer. And so again, when people want to make claims against the Bible and the claims therein, something that we do is point to the tales of Caesar, and we say, look, did Caesar Augustus live? Yes, and we know a lot about him. Well, we know a lot about him because the earliest known evidences we have of him written down are something like 500, 1,000 years after he lived, and they also contain miracle claims. So why do we give the benefit of the doubt for someone like Julius Caesar, who has all these things and farther away than Jesus of Nazareth, whose writings are much closer and also have these miracle claims?
Yeah. So what he does now is kind of moves away from this examining the skeptical stance of some of the ancient historians to other positions with regard to their idea of what, these stories were doing. So this section he calls ancient plausibility structures. And he says, certainly not all ancient intellectuals were skeptical of supernatural phenomena. Thus, for example, Stoics, despite their disdain for immoral mythologies, were known for defending the gods and divination, right? And likewise, thinkers influenced by the Pythagoreans tradition clearly affirmed tangible divine supernatural activities. So again, not all ancient intellectuals were skeptical of supernatural phenomena. He says, while some historians were more inventive than others, we would not, for example, suspect Tacitus of having merely invented the reports of the signs attributed to Vespucian, whatever their historical origin. And so he believes that this same principle then should also hold true for early Christian reports. Celsus and other later critics of Christians sought not to deny, notice, their miracles, but to challenge the value that these phenomena by questioning their source, like sorcery or the social status of Christians.
Right.
So, Celsus didn't necessarily deny the miracles, but he questioned and challenged the value of the miracles by saying, but look at the source of it. Right? Sorcery or the social structure of the Christians.
Yeah.
Clear.
This religion of slaves and women is what the claim against Christianity was. So they can be just dismissed.
What we would call the genetic fallacy, right? Right. Looking at the source of the argument instead of the argument itself. Yeah,
exactly. So we can just dismiss it because this is just the wanton wishes of slaves and women.
Because of them, yeah.
All right, well, how about our good friend Josephus? Well, writing for a more Hellenistic audience sometimes follows the cautious conventions of his Greek contemporaries, adding a non-committal remark after reporting biblical miracles. And again, Josephus is a Jew, and so he probably, more than likely, believed these type of miracles. And so he's trying to tell the story, tell his people's story nonetheless, for a particular audience. And he seems pretty fair in his writings, including when we get to the description of the man that we care about, Jesus. But nevertheless, though, so he does things like plays down Elijah's miracles and some other miracles. But nevertheless, Josephus did believe in miracles and wanted his audience to do the same. That was one of the points that he was probably tasked with and took great care about with his writing. One of the gospel writers was also a Hellenistic historian, yet shares the same essentially Jewish theological frame of reference held by the other gospel writers. Luke, who writes for Christians who believes in a powerful and historically active deity, is not at all reticent to report miracles. In fact, he tends to go out and interview these people that he doesn't have a direct eyewitness of himself being, but how does he know the things that Mary witnessed? Well, because he went out and talked to Mary and talked about them. And so he's not, against telling about these things like the virgin birth, because not only does he know his audience, not only does he understand that they believe in this Isaiah prophecy, but also he's a fellow believer, along with his fellow traveler Paul, in believing that Jesus came as a fulfillment of those things with the ultimate miracle claim of the resurrection.
Yeah.
All right, so Luke, however, is not sensitive enough to some critics' skepticism that distinguishes his own claim from Jesus' resurrection for more incredible popular stories by citing proofs like Acts 1:3, and acknowledging that some find this claim unbelievable, like in Acts 26:8. So he is also saying, listen, audience, this might sound really, really weird, but here's the truth of it. So if all of society is believing that miracles are possible and they happen all the time and the gods are just here and there and everywhere, well, why couch this in a say of like, this might sound weird, but, and so that's one of the things where we need to kind of have a proper understanding of what people thought, how they thought, how historians both told stories and also collected stories here. And even in the Bible itself, the miracle claims are seen as a weird thing that happens.
That's one way to put it, right?
Yes. Very sacrilegious way, probably.
Yeah, that's right. And notice he says here that Luke is saying that he's providing proofs, right? So he knows that it's a weird thing, right? And so he has to give proofs for it, right? And he acknowledges that, some find these types of claims unbelievable. He quotes Acts 26:8 there as a source. All right, well, what about modern Western skepticism towards supernatural phenomena? Well, he says modern scholars sometimes treat wonders as fictitious elements in ancient history, right, including the gospel and Acts. And he said we should recognize, however, that ancients with different plausibility paradigms may well have experienced genuine events that many Western interpreters would attribute to different causes. So he's going to talk more about this, and this is going to be the emphasis here in the rest of this chapter and the next few chapters. He says, moreover, more to the point, in this particular section, modern Western interpreters who are skeptical of all such events or read all of them through a purely naturalistic paradigm are hardly neutral in their assumption. So if you're reading it all through a naturalistic paradigm, then you are not neutral, right? You're looking at it through a particular kind of view, right? And so he says this observation need not suggest that anti-supernaturalism must therefore be logically wrong, right? Just because you're, not neutral doesn't mean you're wrong, but it may suggest, he says, that we need to not assume it as an a priori assumption, right? And so he's going to work on this particular idea here.
Right. And so hopefully, if you've listened to the show long enough, the no neutrality seems to be a common theme here. And even in our history, we need to know that we all have assumptions we're bringing to the table. All right, so no less important for readers of the text from a literary standpoint, we must be aware of simply assuming modern anti-supernaturalism, unsympathetic reading of ancient texts, which diverges starkly from how the first audiences would have heard them. It is a bias that can hinder us from entering their narrative world as fully as their first audiences could. And I always think about this too with how we kind of write history these days or tell a story where we might say a fact and then we might say all these qualifications that say, the car that hit me was a red car. Now, it was a car. It wasn't a van. It was speeding. When I say that, I mean, it was going faster than the posted speed limit. And so we might have all these qualifications to it. Where if you read something like Proverbs and it talks about, train up a child in the way that you shall go, and when he's adult, he'll return to you. Well, my child didn't. So where are all the qualifications for that? Well, it's a different genre. It's a different type of writer. It's not a modern day. So when we are expecting all these things to occur, we need to understand that we're coming at it from a completely different perspective. And it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just to notice that they are different. On the level of a philosophic methodology, to start from a guilty until proven innocent skepticism towards claims of historical narrative reflects what logicians would normally view as the poisoning of the well fallacy. Okay, so if it's a fallacy, we shouldn't do it. We seem to be doing it. So what are we doing here? And so he'll say that he'll briefly introduce and raise questions concerning the historic context of modern Western philosophic assumptions regarding supernatural phenomenon, a context that he'll address more thoroughly in the next two chapters.
Right. All right. So our cultural limitations, the next section here. He says in chapter 7, which he's going to get to in a few chapters later, he's going to include some severe majority world critiques of traditional Western anti-supernaturalism, right? But here he wants to simply introduce the question of the cultural limitations of some of our philosophic presuppositions. Assumptions about reality are often culturally formed. And events that function as reality, right, by the criteria of one culture can shape its history, even if these assumptions are foreign to another culture. He tells us that the noted historian of Greco-Roman antiquity, Ramses MacMullen, warns that history proper does not pass judgment on whether ancients believed rightly or wrongly about their miracle claims. History proper simply describes those beliefs. And so in the wake of post-modernity in the West, the collapse of traditional Western paradigms has led to the reevaluation of a number of long-held interpretations of reality. And so again, how we view things is based on our worldview, our paradigms, our assumptions. And so he wants us to say we need to be careful and examine those carefully.
Yeah, let's take example, the antebellum South in America before the Civil War. If you're a historian of modern day, you might not like reading accounts of slaves who actually enjoy their slavery or who enjoy the type of subjugation that they're under. And so if you don't enjoy that and you don't write about it and those accounts just pass into the wind, well, are you doing history or are you curtailing history by kind of only reporting what you want to be out there? You want the inflammatory, you want those that rose up against their masters to slay them and move to a different island? Or is your job as a historian to just view those as stories of a particular person that you should account for in your accounting of what happened? And so I think that tends to be the case where we're no longer being historians there, and we're being more modern day reporters, and we're in the editorial column, which seems to be all of it these days. All right, so have we privileged a particular Western worldview is the question that he's wanting to posit here. Well, some New Testament scholars have already challenged the traditional critical approach as prejudiced on this point, sometimes by drawing insights from other disciplines or cultures. We talk about the courtroom scene as a big one there, and apply it to a lot of our argumentation. Charles Talbert notes that some scholars, like Gerard Ludemann, rules out any historical core miracle stories because miracles are assumed not to happen. By contrast to such approaches, some writers question whether a priori dismissals of all claims for evidence of supernatural activity is a genuinely open-minded, objective approach. So just because you should dismiss them, whether or not you should actually view them as important to the story. One of those things could be, a particular need for rain prayed about and it rains. Well, if you dismiss that as a miracle claim and don't write about it, why not view that as just a normal happenstance of coincidence? And so by not including it and dismissing it completely as a miracle claim, not including it, you're doing a disservice to the story of history there. So as Talbert notes, the question as to whether miracles are possible reflects the understanding of possibility in one's worldview, and worldviews are highly resistant to disconfirmation, right? Those are our basic belief systems. It's the glasses on the edge of our nose that we peer at the world through, and to try and knock those glasses off is very, very hard because we need them to see. We don't want to take them off. So if we understand, if it hits our worldview too quickly, we need to realize that we are instantly grabbing for our glasses, and we don't want to change them out too often, because that's just not how humans work.
Yeah. And so it says the materialistic worldview represented by Ludemann dictates that the world was and is ruled by iron physical laws that not even God can or could bend. He says this, however, a worldview, right? This is a worldview and not an argument, right? Okay, that's fine. That's what you believe. That's your worldview, but that's not an argument, Scholars, he says, differ in their evaluations of what is possible, evaluations that in turn shape how they evaluate the historical reliability of claims in documents like Acts and the Gospels. And so he says, one philosopher warns that those who dismiss miracles yet are unwilling to offer solid arguments need to admit that they have a faith commitment which precludes the possibility of miracles. And so, all right, so I don't like miracles. I don't believe they happen because I don't believe they happen because I don't believe they can happen. Well, all right, this one philosopher is suggesting that's kind of a faith commitment, and it's not really an argument. I don't believe it happened because I don't believe it can happen. Why not?
And we have to remember, too, that we're doing history, not science. So we're not able to reproduce the pattern of praying for rain at this particular moment in time and then it rains. We can't rewind the clock and do it again and see if we get a different result or the same result. We're accounting for the accountment of history. Our current understanding of ordinary does not comprehensively describe reality. And before we dismiss all possibility of suprahuman intervention, we are obligated to make explicit and evaluate the presuppositions on which a wholesale dismissal would be based. If we take into account the historically conditioned presuppositions favored in antiquity, we must also consider those of modern academia. So if we can easily dismiss the ones that happened then as being wrong because we're right, well, how about somebody in the future looking back at ours and dismissing them because theirs is right? So shouldn't we dismiss ours automatically, right?
Or at least examine them.
Right, or at least examine them. Exactly. So we typically ground our critique of supernatural phenomenon in a modern Western worldview that we do not question. And then we use those untested assumptions to posit an authoritative meta-narrative or construal of reality. Now, some critics may thus immediately dismiss out of hand challenges to examine their worldview, and hence may also dismiss the secondary argument in the book. But he suspects that many of these critics do so on the basis of historically conditioned a prioris that have been never seriously examined and that some hold inflexibility.
All right. So that's kind of part of his main claim here, at least in this section. He tells us the New Testament scholar Walter Wink claims that historical research depends on analogy, and so to evaluate the plausibility of accounts about the past, but warns that our limited experiences can unfairly constrict the analogies with which we work, right? So, my experience tells me that these types of things happen, and therefore this probably couldn't happen. Well, wait a minute. Your experiences are limited, right? And so he gives the illustration of the prince who lacks experiences of freezing because in his climate, it's always warm. And so that prince cannot extrapolate with certainty from his non-experience of it, freezing. And so people in everyday situations cannot extrapolate from their non-experience of potential situations of special divine significance, such as miracle claims imply. Right. So the story is, you go to the prince in this moderate climate and you say, well, I think they were talking about, he gives it here. We didn't take the time to, again, people need to get the book and read it, right? Because there are things that we're leaving out here. But the story is that you confront the prince with folks who are riding, on water, or actually their horses on water. And it's because the water is frozen and they're able to do it. And he says, that can't happen. Right. I've never experienced anything like that, so it can't happen.
Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. Just because you haven't experienced it doesn't mean it can't happen, right? And that's the point he's trying to make here, right?
Yeah. One of the other ones I've also heard is showing people the kind of stair-step picture that we put in all our draft documents of these are where the stairs are, to people who have never seen stairs, never experienced it, and they just see this kind of shape on there, but they don't view it as like a stair shape. Where you hand it to a 5-year-old who's been told not to go down the stairs to the baby gates has always been there, and they go, oh no, that's a stair shape, and so they understand it in a different context because they've been inculcated into that culture that has stairs.
Right. And so the 5-year-old isn't smarter than the adult.
Right.
They just had different experiences, right? And they can make an analogy based on the picture and reality.
Yeah.
And so it says one cannot inductively prove a negative, by the way, without examining, notice, every possible instance. And so this problem becomes increasingly precarious as the sample size grows more limited. So we can't prove a negative. So you can't say that something, cannot happen, right? You can only say it hasn't happened at best, right? Or to your knowledge, it hasn't happened.
Right.
But you can't say it can't not happen, right? Not only is that a double negative, that's trying to prove and claim a negative.
Yeah. I mean, put yourself into America in 1941 and you come across this guy with crazy hair who likes taking pictures with his tongue out. And he says, oh, I've taken these little tiny particles here and I've created a bomb so big that they'll level 2 giant cities. And you just go, well, I know that can't happen because that little bit can't produce this big thing. That's just impossible dismiss it. It's not. It's outside the scope of my understanding of my a priori ideas. And so I know that, what was his name? Dr. Einstein here? Okay, some doctor is going to say that a little thing is going to produce a big explosion. We know that can't happen.
Get back to operating on people.
Yeah, wherever you're from. And so, so there our ideas have shift, because now we see, there's a science behind it. There's people that working, but put people back before 1900 and take an account of people said, well, I put this piece of paper in a fire and I watched it float up. And so I created this balloon and I did the same thing and I went up. Well, no, if God intended man to have wings, then he would have to fly. He would have given him wings. So
you can't ride on fire.
Yeah, exactly. So we know this isn't possible. So we just dismiss it out of hand, and we burn the person at the stake, and it never develops flight. And 50 years later, we're definitely not on the moon from there. So that's where we need to reevaluate some of our worldview there, the unexamined life, if you will.
There you go.
All right, so this conclusion that he had, I pretty much highlighted all of it when I went through it, so it was a really good summation. So for his conclusion, Keener talks about that ancient historiography includes a tradition of suspicion concerning sensational claims about extra paranormal or extra normal phenomenon, as well as often cautious reports of such phenomenon. It was the radical Enlightenment, however, that introduced a thoroughgoing suspicion of all supernatural claims. And while many scholars continue to operate with this radical Enlightenment paradigm, it's dogmatic, perhaps inherited from an earlier era of religious disputes, fares poorly when evaluated from the perspectives and claims of many of our other cultures or a post-Enlightenment critique, which we'll get to in the next couple chapters here. And in the following two chapters, he's going to explore in somewhat more detail modern philosophic objections to miracles. And as he's noted afterwards, however, a global context seriously weakens the pervasive force of these traditional objectives. So even if you don't get this book, you can, if you go to Amazon or Logos and click on the book, you can see kind of the breakdown of the chapters. And you'll notice that he has eyewitness accounts of miracles occurring in places like Asia and the Middle East and all these other places. So he does a big survey of certain miracle claims that are impressive. So again, one of the reasons why we kind of wanted to pick this book is it's kind of a subtle case for both the stories of the Bible, critiques from a philosophical point of view, and also just telling good stories about claims that have been passed on and collected on miracle claims. So that's what we'll do, at least for next time. We're going to stick to the philosophy, and I encourage you to spend your hard-earned money on this book if you want to. Of course, you can always go to caveofthecross.com for everything else. For this book, probably the time of this episode, there's a little picture of the book, and you can click on that, and it'll take you to all 3 of the cover photos. Just click on those, and those are the episodes. So you can do that for any of our other books. So that's it for Chapter 4, and we'll see you for Chapter 5 next time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.